Hello! Welcome back to MysHistory and part 5 of the Mary Surratt series. If you've missed the first 4 episodes, I will link them in the description box below. In part 4, I talked about the timeline of events that would lead to the assassination of Lincoln. This is the rest of this story. You'll remember that Mary had made a couple of trips to Surrattsville, the last believed to be on a mission for Booth to get the last needed supplies to the tavern for the evening of April 14th, 1865. On that final trip, Mary would tell John Lloyd, the tavern renter, to have the shooting irons ready as well as whiskey and the other provisions that had been left at the tavern by the other conspirators. Seriously, I can say words. As stated, Booth had become secretly engaged to a woman named Lucy Hale, and he had attended Lincoln's second inaugural speech with her. On April 11th of 1865, Booth was in a crowd of people listening to an impromptu speech given by Lincoln from his window at the White House. During this speech, Lincoln would come out in favor of granting suffrage to former slaves, which would make Booth angry. He was pissed. And then he would go on to state that that would be the last speech that Lincoln would ever give. Foreshadowing. April 12th, 1865 is when Booth would learn that Robert E. Lee had officially surrendered at the Appomattox Courthouse. It's alleged that Booth then told Lewis Weichman, while at Mary's boarding house, that he had decided to be done with the state and that the only play he wanted to present in the future was Venice Preserved. Weichman didn't understand the reference, and it turns out Venice Preserved is a tragedy that was originally written in the 1680s. It's an English restoration play that was written by Thomas Otway and first appeared on stage in 1682. The premise of the play is that an impoverished yet noble Venetian secretly married the daughter of a proud senator who then cut off her inheritance because of her marriage. Jaffir, the Venetian, resented his father-in-law and convinced his friend Pierre, who was a foreign soldier, to assassinate the senator along with other conspirators. This would be the role of a lifetime for Booth, to be sure. With his plan to kidnap Lincoln unfeasible, the fall of Richmond, and the surrender of Lee, Booth dug into his new goal of assassination. Like I said in part 4, Booth would go and pick up his mail at Ford's Theater on April 14th, 1865, where he learned that Lincoln would be attending the play Our American Cousin that evening, along with General Grant and his wife. He would then make arrangements with a livery stable owner, James Pumphrey. James was an acquaintance of John Jr., who was the one that introduced him to Booth. His stable was located near the National Hotel, where Booth resided at the time. James had one particular horse that Booth preferred, so this was the horse that he requested from James, but he was informed that the horse was unavailable, and so Booth would have to hire a different horse. Booth said that he would pick up that horse in the afternoon around 4 o'clock. 4 o'clock that afternoon, Booth arrived at the stable to pick up the horse and was informed by James that she was high-spirited and would break the halter if unattended. Booth would tell James that he was going to Grover's Theater, which was the former name of the National Theater, to write a letter, after which he was going to have a drink somewhere and then take a leisurely ride. Booth was not completely dishonest with James. It's just that he didn't go to Grover's Theater to write his letter. He wrote it at the National Hotel and addressed it to the editor of the National Intelligencer. In his letter, he would state that his plans to kidnap Lincoln had changed to assassinating him, and he would add the names of his co-conspirators at the end of the letter: Lewis Powell, Payne, George Asderod, and David Harold. I find it odd that he would leave out the names of Mary and John, but perhaps he just wanted to protect his friends. Once his letter was complete, he would get a drink at the Star Saloon, which was located close to Ford's Theater, with some of the stagehands of the theater. Among those was Edmund Spangler, who had earlier that afternoon been asked by theater owner Harry Ford to help prepare the state box for the president's attendance that evening. He would work to bring in furniture and remove a partition between box numbers 7 and 8 to create a larger box for the president and his guests. While getting drinks with the other stagehands and Booth mentioned that he might be back to the theater that evening to attend the performance. That evening, the president, Mrs. Lincoln, and their guests arrived at the theater. General Grant and his wife had declined the president's invitation at the last moment and opted to travel to Burlington, New Jersey to celebrate the end of the war with their children. The president would then extend an invitation to another couple, Miss Clara Harris and her fiancé, Major Henry Rathbone. The foursome had settled into the box at the theater and were enjoying the play. Around 9:30 that evening, Booth would appear at the theater, dismount his horse, and ask Spangler to hold his mare due to the work he had to do. Spangler would explain that he would ask another stagehand, Joseph Burroughs, to hold the horse. At some point during the third act, the president and his wife would draw closer together and hold hands. Mary would lean into her husband and whisper, "What will Miss Harris think of my hanging on to you so?" To which the president would smile and say, "She won't think anything about it." The time was around 10:15 p.m. when Booth would enter the box where the president sat and shot President Lincoln in the back of the head with a .41 caliber Derringer pistol while the president held his wife's hand. Booth almost did not escape the presidential box because Major Rathbone lunged at him and was stabbed by Booth. Booth would then jump from the presidential box to the stage, raise his knife in the air, and shout, "Sic semper tyrannis," which is Latin for "thus always to tyrants." There are also accounts that he further added, "I have done it. The South is avenged." And with that, he would run across the stage, exit the theater. There are accounts that he either broke or fractured his leg after catching a spur on one of the flags adorning the stage, but others contend that he may not have due to his quick exit. Although it could be that he was so crazed and in a frenzy, and adrenaline and everything, that what he had just done, maybe he didn't even realize that he had injured his leg. Maybe. At any rate, he would get on his horse and start riding out of D.C., where he would meet up with fellow conspirator David Harold, and the two would bribe their way out of D.C. and into Maryland. They had to bribe their way because guards were informed that no crossings were allowed after 9 p.m. It's after 10. The guards would allow them to pass, and they would then start heading to the tavern in Surrattsville. While all of this is going on, Lewis Payne was at the home of William Seward, who had been injured in a carriage accident and was recovering at home. Seward's servant would answer Payne's knocks, and Payne would pretend to be a messenger from Seward's doctor and tell the servant that he was there to deliver medication to Seward. But the servant was insistent that Seward could have no visitors. Payne would push his way upstairs. Seward's son, Frederick, would intervene outside of his father's bedroom, and Payne would attack him, beating him almost to death with the butt of his pistol. Payne would then burst into Seward's room and be confronted by Seward's daughter, Fanny, and an army private, George Robinson. Payne would attack Robinson, slashing and stabbing him around his head, leaving him immobile, and then focus on his target, William Seward, who laid in a bed. Payne would stab Seward and leave near fatal wounds around his head and his neck. He had a gun. Anyway, when the commotion of what was happening had other members of the house rushed to the room, Payne fled, but not before attacking Augustus Seward, another son, and Emmerich Hansel on his way out. Due to the chaos of the attacks in the house, it was really easy for him to make a quick escape. Payne was certain that he had been successful in his part of the assassination plot. George Asderod, assigned to assassinate Vice President Johnson, would lose his nerve and spend his evening drinking instead. So, as stated, Booth and Harold had planned an escape route once they bribed their way out of D.C. They would take advantage of the sparsely settled areas along predominantly Confederate sympathies through Maryland. They would arrive at the Surratt's Tavern around midnight, where they collected the supplies waiting for them. They would then continue south toward Virginia, where they stopped before dawn at the home of Dr. Samuel Mudd to treat Booth's leg injury. Mudd would later say that he was told that Booth injured his leg when his horse fell on him. So there was a leg injury. We don't know how it happened. Also in those pre-dawn hours, in D.C., Weichman would make a trip to the outhouse in the back of the boarding house. He would return and be startled by the ringing of the front doorbell, and he would quickly pull on pants and leave his shirt open as he stumbled to the door to call out who is there. He was met with the response from Detective James McDevitt from the Metropolitan Police. Detectives come to search the house for John Wilkes Booth and John Surratt. Weichman would inform them that the men were not there, and McDevitt would say, "Let us in anyhow." Yeah, you got a warrant. So this would prompt Weichman to go to the room of Mary and say, "Here, Miss Surratt, are detectives who have come to search the house." Mary would respond from the other side of the door, "For God's sake, let them come in. I expected the house to be searched." Really? The detectives would then enter the house where Weichman, still half dressed and in his stocking feet, would lead them to the parlor. But the detectives would immediately spread throughout the house, searching for both Booth and Surratt. They would enter Weichman's room, search his closet, under his bed. They searched the hall. When Weichman demanded to know why they were searching for Booth and Surratt in the early morning hours, he was met with the response, "Do you pretend to tell me you do not know what happened last night?" Detectives were shocked to learn that Weichman had not heard about the events of the evening of April 14th, and one of them said, "I will tell you." He took a bloody necktie from his pocket, so much for preserving evidence in 1865, showed it to Weichman saying, "Do you see this blood? That is Abraham Lincoln's blood. John Wilkes Booth has murdered Abraham Lincoln, and John Surratt has assassinated the Secretary of State." Detectives were not yet aware that it was Seward who had survived his attack and that it was Payne and not Surratt who was responsible. Weichman was asked if he had been in the boarding house all evening the night before, and he was really honest and said that no, he hadn't been, that he had gone with Mary to Surrattsville earlier in the day and returned to the house around 8:30 that night. This is when things started to become very clear to Weichman. The many visits, secret meetings, weapons, strange men coming and going, other seemingly insignificant events were now more clear and confirmed more than he imagined. Weichman would then say aloud, "Great God, I see it all. I see it all now." I'm sure he felt used and very much kind of like a pawn when he realized all of the things that he had seen and heard were Booth planning to kill the president, which President Lincoln would die at 7:52 on the morning of April 15th, 1865. Detectives would search the rest of the home, with Weichman following them to the second floor and the room of Mary. Detectives would note that Mary had changed her clothes while they were searching the rest of the house. As the detectives Clairvaux and McDevitt spoke, Weichman would approach Mary and say, "What do you think, Mrs. Surratt? President Lincoln has been murdered by John Wilkes Booth, and the Secretary of State has been assassinated." Mary would appear shocked at the news when Detective Clairvaux would ask, "Mrs. Surratt, I want to ask you a couple of questions, and be particular how you answer them, for there is a great deal that depends on them. When did you last see John Wilkes Booth?" She stated that she had last seen Booth at 2 o'clock on the afternoon of April 14th. Clairvaux then asked, "When did you see your son last, and where is he?" Mary said that she hadn't seen her son in 2 weeks, and that she thought he was in Canada as she had received a letter from him postmarked Montreal. However, when asked to produce the letter, she said she couldn't find it. This would then prompt Mary to become irritated and defensive, demanding to know what was going on and reminding officers that there were many mothers who had no idea where their sons were. What was weird was that John's on and off girlfriend and Boardinghouse resident Anna had a packet of letters from John, but Mary, who always seemed concerned about her son and his whereabouts, would misplace her most recent correspondence from him. Maybe she was hiding something. Detectives were unable to find Booth or Surratt in the house or any other suspicious people, and then they would leave. Anna would scream out to Mary, "Oh, Ma, just think of it. That man having been here in the house before the assassination. I am afraid that it will bring suspicion upon us all." To which Mary would respond, "Anna, come what will, I am resigned. I think John Wilkes Booth was only an instrument in the hands of the Almighty to punish this proud and licentious people." Weichman would be unable to sleep for the rest of the evening and early morning, and he would begin replaying the events of the past several months in his head. The secret meetings, the conversations, the strange people visiting and staying at the house, John's frequent absences, the unaccounted for gold that John had, Booth's frequent presence. He would become convinced that John could not have been the one to attack Seward, as he had seen the letter from John to Mary, though he did not read it. But this would have him wonder why Mary would not provide proof of her son being elsewhere and could not have been involved in the events of the evening before. Around 5 o'clock that morning, Weichman would dress and go to Howard's stables on G Street, where he would discuss his suspicions with Brooks Stabler. Convinced that it was not John who attacked Seward, but Astorad, who to Weichman seemed more like a person who would commit such crime. On his walk back to the house, he ran into fellow boarder John Houlihan, who confided to Weichman that he too had been suspicious of all the happenings at the house over the past several months. The two would agree to find McDevitt at the police station and tell him of their suspicions. Before that, they would have breakfast at the boarding house and catch up on the latest news of the prior evening's events. It was in reading the news that Weichman would get the description of Seward's attacker, and he was described as larger than John. This did not absolve John in Weichman's mind, but he wondered what part, if any, John had in Booth's larger plan, and if he knew what Booth was planning. How did the detectives know to search the boarding house? What could a widow, mother, businesswoman, devout Catholic have to do with such an insidious plot? With so many characters, so many moving parts, so much history. This has been a very interesting series for me, and I hope for you as well. In the next part, we'll discuss Booth's further escape and the arrests of the co-conspirators, including Mary. Let me know your thoughts down in the comments. Don't forget to like and subscribe, and I will see you in part 6. Bye.